8. Descent. The line seemed sturdy enough, even if it was loose and writhed beneath the climbers which descended it. It was the jaws through which they slunk that worried Luther. Still, he had come this far, and to his amazement, he was able to go through the motions of preparing for the climb down as if they weren't about to drop into the gullet of a malign god. Aram went first, the only one to truly hook himself into the line via his belt. It wasn't a secure connection, but he knew full well he'd only be able to slow his slide down so much using his one good hand. Moreover, if he fell, he didn't wish to drag anyone else along with him. He would skid down, letting gravity do the work, gloved hand hugging the line and legs grating the slick wall of the throat to keep the fall under control. The others, with the noises of pursuit from the clearing's edge looming over them, would have to shimmy down the rope like climbers in a school gym. Aram moved fast, likely more due to difficulty controlling the descent than any desire for speed. The mouth grew wider and the oblong, gigantic teeth more sparse as the first few rows passed and Aram went deeper, bringing him away from the fleshy wall of the canyon and leaving him to dangle and drop in midair as he slid along the rope, his gloved hand and bloodied pants crying out like brakes on a roadway as he went. In just moments he was out of view, and for a panicked moment, Luther, who had always been so distant among his family, worried Aram would bleed out and fall into unconsciousness before they reached the bottom in the deep darkness below. Then, as one of the upper rows of teeth flexed lazily before his eyes, the full gravity, the full insanity of what he was about to do came crashing down upon him. Soraya went next, waiting only half a minute or so before adding his weight to the line. Agile despite his size and clearly trained for the task at hand, Soraya descended with both his and Aram's weapons upon his back, in addition to most of the gear they felt they'd need in the bowels of the wakening god below their feet. It had been condensed into one bulging backpack, mostly food, water, ammunition, small climbing picks, knives, and a strange 4-foot metal spike whose purpose Luther could only guess at, but it was still woefully heavy. Luther was amazed at the steady progress the big man made, placing one huge hand beneath the other as if the weight was negligible. Then, as shrieks which were somehow both pained and ecstatic echoed up the slopes into the clearing from the woods behind them, Stan stepped forward and motioned for Luther to begin the climb. "I'll watch our backs," Stan said. "You go on ahead." "I'm slow," Luther told him. "I haven't trained. I'm not sure how well I'll do climbing down. You go. I'll bring up the rear." Stan didn't argue. They didn't have time to argue. He just fixed his shotgun to his back with the bandolier he had, and started the wobbly climb down. Nothing Luther had said had been a lie, but he also didn't want Stan watching the line alone. Whether because of the shock of his injury, some insight about the character of the stranger, or the nearness of his goal, Aram seemed to have accepted the newcomer without question. But Luther, ever paranoid, was not so sure. Stan had saved them, of course, but like Aram and Soraya, he was apparently aware of a whispering done by the dreamer. The grizzled man had been on his own out here for over a day. Who could say what the stirring god had breathed into the mind of this newcomer? Stan's readiness to descend and the sympathetic expression he gave dispelled some of that suspicion, but Luther couldn't set it aside entirely. Not yet. Luther had struggled to rationalize why he'd felt the loss of the near strangers who he'd traveled east with so keenly, why he'd silently lamented their deaths as he might have mourned the deaths of old friends. Though he still couldn't put words to every reason, the main drive, to his mind, was the stress of the situation, and the closeness that demanded of everyone who'd followed Aram on his quest to kill a god. Luther recalled reading a passage in a First World War memoir he'd picked up in college, Storm of Steel, or something to that effect, about how a man who would drive you mad in the streets back home became a brother to you in the trenches. Perhaps this was something similar. Even as a relative outsider to the group, who had never been initiated into their call of the mountain, the hunters and arcane abominations which had scuttled and stalked the shadows beneath the storm and the crimson expanses of the Deadlands were so alien, so hateful, that Aram and his band of New World barbarians seemed tender and familial by comparison. The family he'd lost when he'd rejected the mysticism and strange spirituality of his father and left home at the cusp of adulthood had been regained in a way he'd never have expected, or even desired, in the confines of the world which had existed before the storms. Much as he still felt like an office drone from Chicago masquerading with Viking raiders, he wasn't about to allow the last of their number to be stabbed in the back while they faced down their final, awful obstacle. But Stan, to his credit, made steady progress down the line without any sign of ulterior motive, gritting his teeth against the strain wrought by his bulk and his age. Sinking out of clear view into the misty blackness which reigned a short distance below, he left Luther alone for a moment on the brink, exhausted, afraid, and struggling to gather courage for the trip down. It was then, isolated and in the depths of self-doubt, that he heard it, felt it grate along the surface of his mind like a briar upon tender skin. The vibration of it shook him, though he knew it was no more than a sensation dropped with cautious care into his thoughts. It was whispering. It came with the sensation of thought. It was not so much heard as understood, but there was no doubt in Luther's mind it had come from beyond his consciousness. Though it had no sound, he would have described it as low, powerful, threatening but paradoxically soothing. It was the tone of one who has never known fear, and wishes to impart that bravery to the listener. At first, the whispers told him he was not strong enough to descend the line. The unseen speaker who spoke without speaking sold this as concern, told him the forest would be a safer place for him to be. Grappling with how to interpret what he was experiencing, Luther looked towards the otherworldly woodland at the clearing's edge. The churning masses of black-furred beasts which spilled from the shadows beneath the boughs drove him over the lip and into the mouth, trying his best to tune out the invasive thoughts. As he began his long climb down, hand below hand, counting every sliding motion he made along the line, the whispers changed tact. They told him Aram was all but dead, and that Stan couldn't be trusted. Could he really even be certain about Soraya? What would Luther do when Aram was gone, and the stranger was alone with the two of them? Did he think he could kill him, if it came to that? He focused on the rope alone. The burning in his shoulders and arms steadily increased as he moved farther down, and the clenching of his legs around the rope for momentary rests was only ever fleeting. He couldn't afford to rest. The shrieking brays of hunting packs above told him all he needed to know about what approached the mouth from above. Shrill and powerful as the whispers were, the bleeding horde which closed in behind them was a far more immediate threat, and it was that which drove him on as he summoned the will to keep moving. So focused was he on the physicality of the descent that he didn't truly observe his surroundings until well after he'd passed through the largest rows of teeth, and the fleshy walls of the mouth sprawled away to either side, leaving him dangling in the open air. The smell had been awful before, but here it grew all but unbearable. While it had the chemical tang of the dreamer's blood in it, the stench was doubtless that of rot. Great slick swathes of a thick and clotted mucus coated the incarnadine meat of the canyon-turned maw's walls. As more rows of smaller, vestigial teeth came into view, Luther saw that the broken forms of corpses were often lodged in the tightest groupings of the yellowed, gently swaying fangs. Some were men, and others were animals. Many fit neither category. Perhaps they were offerings, thrown by rapturous worshippers into the mouth as food for the hungry god, as it stirred from its ancient sleep. Perhaps they were pulled into the mouth by some ensnarement wrought by the dreamer itself, convinced by hopelessness and the damnable whispers to fling themselves into the dark below. Whatever the case, they had been there long enough for the gelatinous mucus, likely mildly acidic, like a sort of saliva, to collect on their bodies and begin the process of breaking them down. The flesh of the dead sloughed off moist bone and collected in liquescent drifts along the roots of the teeth, building up there until the mass grew heavy enough to send it tumbling into the shadows of the unseen throat somewhere below. The falling, pre-digested corpses, combined with the dripping mucus and the hot mist of the dreamer's inconsistent breaths, made the place feel like a putrescent jungle in the rainy season, and the miasma of rot which surrounded Luther was so strong it left him lightheaded. As his vision wavered, he had a moment to wonder how the already injured Aram was faring in the murk below him on the juddering, unsteady line before the barbed whispers about treachery and danger forced him to focus on the physical once more. The line bucked and shuddered beneath the weight of the 4 men using it. The rifle over his shoulder jostled awkwardly each time he moved. What should have been a simple, if physically demanding, descent was made deadly by the lack of tethers and the free-fall feeling each climber had dangling in the open. Luther didn't even have time to worry that the line might break or be cut by the closing hunters above, or that the piton overhead might be improperly secured. He was too busy catching his weight each time the line shifted, as he slid slowly and steadily down it, catching his breath as his sleep-deprived, scattered mind raced to subjugate his screaming muscles and force them to continue struggling ever downward. Minutes passed like that, feeling like hours as the light grew fainter and the teeth died away. The smell never abated, but the walls of the mouth drew in close again, now far softer, and dotted with waxy yellow pools that looked like weeping abscesses. Lights flicked on somewhere below, and a call came up to him after a long and hushed moment to tell the men still on the line they didn't have far to go. It was Soraya rather than Aram who spoke, Luther had time to realize through the blinding strain. The whispers died with the words, as if chased off by the intrusion of company. Only when Luther was beginning to feel he might be literally unable to continue, that his raw hands might actually slip away as his body gave out, did his feet squelch onto an unsteady, wet floor. Luther caught his balance and snatched up his flashlight. The floor of the mouth was studded with pools and piles of pus and rotten runoff from above, and the mucus along the floor made it treacherous to take steps across it. The cavernous space they now stood in was flanked by a sloped, ridged tunnel of rippling, living tissue which led off at an angle from the bottom of the yawning mouth, letting the pooled filth drain into it down deep grooves set into its edges. It was perhaps 30 feet in diameter, and Stan was already at the cusp of it, scouting the way further down. Aram lay against the remnants of a broken tooth not far off, pale far beyond his usual hue, with Soraya kneeling over him and placing his gun back into his functional hand. Yowls and the clatter of hooves sounded far away, echoing down into the mouth from the lip. Luther did his best to ignore these, pressing slowly and steadily across the slippery basin to look over Aram with Soraya. Hazy as he seemed, his older brother recognized him there, and though his breathing was shallow and his voice was anything but strong, Luther heard no tremor in it when he managed to speak. "I am staying here while you all press on," Aram said. "If I can stay awake long enough, maybe I can slow a few of the things from above down, assuming they climb in after us." "How will we get where we need to go without you steering?" Luther demanded. "You've been the one calling the shots till now. We wouldn't have made it this far without you." "I'd be guessing as much as any of you at this point," Aram answered with a dismissive shake of his tired head. "Your gambles are as good as mine now. No initiate has ever been inside the enemy. Prior generations tried, of course, but it was always buried too deep in the mountains, with too many of its children minding the tunnels. Now, a loud smack sounded as a heavy body thundered through the tepid air to splatter amidst the rock pools off to the side, cutting Aram off. It was horned, hooved, the warped spawn of the dreamer. The line down which they'd climbed snapped, and in several moments it too crashed to the fleshy floor alongside 7 or 8 twisted hunters, some of whom writhed and twitched in the morass of god saliva, not quite dead. Stan sloshed over to begin shooting the things up close, dispatching them with the cold efficiency of a butcher as the chorus of wrathful baying surged overhead. "They'll find the way down," Aram called, doing his best to fight the frailty of his voice. "Take the stake to the heart. Drive it in with the hammer I kept in the pack. Don't stop until you're certain the thing's dead. And don't assume anything about the layout of the body. This is just one of many mouths, and it likely leads to one of many stomachs. There's no telling where exactly the heart will be. Find the veins if you can. Follow the current. Dig through the meat with your knives if you must. Don't rest until the job is done." Aram slumped back, his energy already ebbing. Luther doubted as he watched the man that he'd survived to see any of the horde at the mouth's precipice reach the bottom alive and ready to hunt. As Soraya said his solemn goodbyes and moved off to join Stan, Luther leaned in close. "I've heard the whispers, Aram," he said. "Like the others. Like you said I wouldn't. The whole way down it talked to me." "It's something we've all had to put up with," Aram muttered. "You're stronger than I took you to be, Luther. Just grit your teeth and move fast. It can only tell you so much before the 3 of you get to the heart." Aram grunted, hoisting the rifle he awkwardly grasped so the butt sat in the crook of his arm at an angle. It wouldn't be accurate, but assuming he lasted long enough to see the many glinting eyes of their pursuers, he might put a few rounds into them before the end. "It's a shame I couldn't make it," Aram said, almost scolding himself. "I would have liked to kill a god." Luther lingered, scrabbling to think of something to say which wouldn't seem cheap and artificial in the plastic glow of the meager flashlight, at the cusp of the impossible. He found nothing. "Go," Aram ordered. Luther obeyed.